Montana always woke slow, as if the land itself needed a long breath before letting the sun in. On most mornings, Caleb Rourke was already outside before the first streak of gold touched the horizon. The prairie spread around him like an endless, wind-brushed ocean, tall grasses shimmering under the cold dawn. The scent of pine resin, dry sage, and old saddle leather clung to the air, those familiar, rugged smells he had grown up with. And far beyond the fields, the mountains rose in violet layers, their snowy crowns catching the early light like quiet sentinels. This land was the only place where Caleb felt something close to peace, and also the place where his loneliness echoed the loudest. He ran the Rourke Ranch alone now, a sprawling piece of earth and sky his father had fought tooth and nail to hold on to. After the blizzard years ago swallowed his father's truck whole and left Caleb with a responsibility bigger than himself, life had narrowed into a simple pattern. Work hard, breathe steady, trust no one but the land. Most days, Caleb barely spoke a full paragraph. Words felt wasteful when there was always more fencing to mend, more cattle to track, more horses to corral before winter storms rolled in. His closest companions were a pair of loyal cattle dogs, Dusty and Blue, and a bay stallion named Crow who had more attitude than sense. They understood him perfectly, better than most people ever had. He ate with the sunrise, worked until his muscles burned, and returned home only when dusk painted the prairie in bruised shades of orange and charcoal. The silence around him was not peaceful. It was vast, unyielding, the kind of silence that pressed into a man's ribs and stayed there. Sometimes late at night, when the wind groaned through the barn boards, Caleb wondered if the land felt the weight of his solitude just as he did. He kept his father's lantern on the porch, an old dented thing with soot along the glass. The light didn't reach far, but it reached enough. Maybe that was why he never blew it out completely. It was the last piece of warmth he allowed himself. Caleb wasn't afraid of storms or hard winters or long nights, but he was afraid of something quieter, the idea of letting someone close enough to leave a mark. That fear shaped him more than all the miles of prairie he rode. On that particular day, the sky was the color of tarnished steel, thick with the promise of rain. Caleb finished checking the north pasture fence, wiped the sweat and dust from his jaw, and started walking back toward the ranch house. Dusty trotted beside him, tail sweeping low, while Blue bounded ahead chasing grasshoppers. It should have been an ordinary afternoon, silent, predictable, like 100 before it. But as Caleb followed the dirt road home, boots crunching in the gravel, a strange feeling tugged at him, the kind that made a man slow down without knowing why. The wind carried a scent he couldn't name. Not pine, not dust. Something human. Something unfamiliar. He was halfway down the road when it happened. A faint voice floated across the field, thin, uncertain, and not from anyone he recognized. "Hey, can you help me?" Caleb stopped dead in his tracks. The prairie held its breath with him. Even the dogs froze. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't panic. Just a call, soft enough to be carried by the wind, strong enough to pull him out of himself. Caleb lifted his head slowly, eyes scanning the wavering field of sun-browned grass. The sky dimmed behind him, letting the moment stretch long and quiet. There, on the other side of a sagging wooden fence, stood a figure he'd never seen before. A woman, tall, sharply outlined against the dull afternoon light. Her long, dark hair moved like a black ribbon in the wind. One hand gripped a broken gate. The other shaded her eyes as she looked directly at him. Something in that still, distant silhouette nudged at the part of him he tried to keep locked tight. Dusty barked once. Caleb hadn't planned on stopping. He'd meant to head straight home, wash the dust off his arms, maybe heat up leftover stew. But the moment he heard that voice and spotted the struggling figure at the fence line, something tightened in his chest, an instinct older than caution. The wooden gate was half collapsed, its top hinge torn loose, the bottom scraped raw from dragging against the dirt. The wind caught it just right, causing the whole thing to shudder like it might peel off the post entirely. And there, bracing it with her shoulder, stood a woman he'd never seen before. She wasn't from around here. He could tell that instantly. The woman had the quiet, enduring strength you only saw in people who grew up listening to the earth breathe. Her long black hair was braided loosely with strips of leather and a few small eagle feathers, unkempt but purposeful. Her skin carried the warm undertone of desert sun, and her cheekbones were sharp, dignified, unmistakably Apache. Her clothes were simple, a worn work shirt rolled to the elbows, a woven belt at her waist, and boots scuffed to the color of dust. But it was her eyes that stopped Caleb mid-step. They were dark, steady, and deep, like looking into an old well where stories slept at the bottom. Eyes that could map the horizon in one blink and still hold secrets. She didn't call for help again. She just pressed her weight against the failing gate, jaw set, trying to keep it upright until the next gust of wind passed. Caleb cleared his throat. "You got a stubborn one there." The woman turned her head slightly, not startled, just acknowledging him. "I've noticed," she said, voice low and textured, like it had been shaped by canyon echoes and long miles of silence. "You trying to fix it alone?" he asked. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, wry but tired. "I wasn't planning on fixing it by letting it fall on me." She didn't ask for help outright. People raised on these lands rarely did. But it was written in the tension of her shoulders, the way her fingers dug into the weathered wood, that she was one strong gust away from losing the battle. Caleb stepped closer. "Mind if I—" She shifted aside without another word. That, he noticed, was its own kind of trust. He knelt, inspecting the splintered hinge and the cracked post. "This thing's seen better years," he muttered. Then he set his toolbox down and got to work. His hands moved the way they always did. Sure, quiet, almost methodical. Years of fixing fences, gates, roofs, saddles. Years of surviving by knowing when wood would hold and when it'd give, had carved skill into his bones. He wedged the gate upright, propped it with his boot, then began removing the rusted hinge. Metal groaned in protest. The woman watched him with that silent, respectful attentiveness. No hovering, no fussing, just presence. People in town often talked too much when he worked, filling the air with noise to hide their unease. This woman didn't. She stood with her arms crossed, hair moving in the breeze, eyes focused on his hands like she understood the language of doing more than the language of speaking. A few times their gazes brushed, just a flicker, quick as a match strike. Each time, both of them looked away as though the moment had been too bright, too revealing. As he replaced the hinge with a spare from his box, he noticed small details, the calluses on her fingers, a thin silver bracelet with Apache stamping patterns, the faint scent of juniper leaves and smoke clinging to her shirt. This wasn't someone drifting through. This was someone who belonged to the land as much as any coyote, sagebrush, or running creek. When he tested the gate and it swung cleanly for the first time in years, she exhaled, a soft, relieved sound that tugged something deep inside his chest. He stepped back, wiping his palms on his jeans. "That should hold," he said, "at least till the next storm decides to pick a fight." For the first time, she looked him full in the face. "Thank you," she said. Not polite, not formal, just honest. He nodded once. Talking more felt dangerous, like stepping off a bluff without checking the ground. She shifted her weight, studying him with that calm Apache stillness. "What's your name, rancher?" "Caleb Rourke." "Leah," she replied. "Leah Nez." Her voice carried her name softly, like she'd said it to the wind more often than to people. Caleb stepped back, prepared to leave before things got strange, before that flicker in his chest turned into something else. But Leah spoke again, almost casually, almost shyly. "If I make cornbread tomorrow," her eyes lowered, then lifted, steady, curious. "Yeah, would you taste it?" Caleb swallowed, feeling an unfamiliar warmth climb into his throat. "I reckon I would," he said. A breeze passed between them, lifting her braid, ruffling his hat brim. Something unspoken settled in the space they shared. Small, fragile, but there. The first seed of something neither of them had planned for. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Caleb hadn't expected. Quiet, steady, and strangely comforting. He found himself noticing things he hadn't before. An extra mug on his porch from when Leah had stopped by to return a borrowed tool. Footprints in the dust near the property line. Or the faint scent of sage drifting from her side of the land when the wind blew north. Each morning, as he rode out to check the pastures or walk the fence line with Dusty and Blue, he'd catch sight of her, always at the boundary between their properties, always doing something with purpose. Sometimes she was kneeling in the dirt, planting seeds of sweetgrass and prairie mint, plants sacred to her people. Sometimes she tended to a patch of wildflowers, coaxing life out of the stubborn earth with a tenderness that surprised him. And sometimes she just stood there, palms lifted, breathing in the dawn like she was listening to the land hum beneath her feet. She spoke even less than Caleb, but when she did, her words had weight, quiet, deliberate, like stones placed in a riverbed. One morning, as Caleb was wrestling with a bale of hay, he heard a frustrated sigh from the other side of the fence. Leah stood over a metal pipe half buried near her shed, her brows knit, sleeves rolled high. Water dribbled weakly from the end, then sputtered out entirely. Caleb crossed the fence before she asked. "Pump giving you trouble?" he asked, crouching beside her. "It's been coughing for 2 days," Leah replied, pushing hair from her forehead. "And today it finally gave up." He inspected the intake line, fingers moving with practiced ease. "Clogged," he muttered. "Sand and grit stuck in the filter." Leah stepped back, allowing him space. Not hovering, not questioning, just letting him work. That small courtesy felt rare in a world full of people who didn't know when to stay quiet. When he fixed the blockage and the pump sputtered back to life with a healthy rush of water, Leah's shoulders eased. The faintest smile touched her lips. "Wait here," she said. She disappeared into her small house and returned with 2 steaming tin cups. The smell hit him first. Rich, smoky, earthy, nothing like the store-bought blends he was used to. "Apache roast," she said simply, "hand ground." He took a sip. It was strong enough to wake the dead, but smooth in a way that made the warmth linger in his chest. "Good," he murmured. Leah only nodded, as if she'd known he'd say that. They stood there drinking in the shadow of her shed, surrounded by the scent of damp soil and fresh water. The prairie winds swept over them, tugging at her braid and rustling his shirt. Words weren't necessary, and yet somehow words came. Caleb found himself telling her about his father, the way the man had taught him to mend fences before he was tall enough to see over them, the way he used to whistle old cowboy tunes while working the land. He talked about the winter storm that stole him away, the silence that filled the ranch afterward, and how he'd tried to fill it with work, responsibility, and miles upon miles of open sky. Leah listened without interrupting. When she spoke, it wasn't to offer pity, it was to share a truth of her own. "I used to work in the city," she said quietly, "helping run a health program for our tribal communities. It was loud, fast. Every day felt like running through fire." She looked at her hands, the ones now stained with soil instead of paperwork. "I left because I couldn't hear myself anymore. Couldn't hear the earth. Couldn't sleep." Her voice carried the weariness of someone who had walked away from a life that demanded too much. Caleb nodded. He understood more than she realized. They were both survivors of different storms. From that day on, things shifted between them. Not in big ways, but in the soft, nearly invisible ones. Caleb found himself drifting toward the fence more often, just to see what she was growing. Leah started leaving a mug of coffee on his fence post when mornings were cold. Sometimes he'd fix something small on her land without telling her, a loose board, a wobbly latch, and she'd repay him with herbs tied in cotton string or a small pouch of roasted beans. It wasn't conversation that brought them closer, it was presence. One evening, after fixing a hinge on her shed door, Caleb lingered. The sun dipped low, turning the prairie gold and amber. Leah stepped onto her porch, her braid catching the last blaze of light. She didn't invite him in, he didn't ask. They just stood there, side by side, separated by a few feet in a shared silence, watching the sunlight wash across the fields. And strangely, impossibly, the silence between them felt warm, as if neither of them had been alone in a very long time. The storm didn't give warning. Montana storms rarely did. They arrived like unwelcome riders, tearing across the prairie with a fury that made even seasoned ranchers mutter prayers under their breath. Caleb had just finished settling the horses in the barn when the first crack of thunder split the sky open. A second blast followed, deeper, meaner, shaking the wooden beams overhead. Dusty whined. Blue pressed close to Caleb's leg. The air smelled of wet dirt, lightning, and that sharp metallic edge that meant the storm wasn't just passing through, it intended to stay a while. By the time Caleb stepped back into his house, rain hammered the roof so hard it sounded like 1,000 angry fists. He lit his father's lantern, set it by the window, and braced himself for a long night. He wasn't expecting the knock. It came faintly at first, almost swallowed by the roar of the storm. Then again, harder, urgent. Caleb froze, instinct tightening every muscle in his body. No one came out this far in weather like this. No one should. He opened the door, and the sight stole his breath. Leah stood on his porch, drenched to the bone. Her braid clung to her shoulder like a dark rope, clothes soaked through, boots dripping onto the wooden boards. The wind whipped behind her, swirling rain around her like she'd been carved out of the storm itself. But her eyes, usually steady and unshaken, held something fragile. She was trembling. Her voice cracked. She swallowed, tried again. I can't. The thunder. A violent crash cracked the sky in half. Leah flinched violently, shoulders curling inward. Whatever words she'd meant to say dissolved into the storm. Caleb stepped aside immediately. Get in, now! Leah didn't argue. She slipped through the doorway, hugging her arms tightly around herself. Water dripped from her sleeves, forming a small pool on the floor. Her breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. I'm sorry, she whispered. I don't handle storms well. I saw something once, years ago, a bad accident during a thunderstorm. The way she said it, quiet, ashamed, like it was a weakness, hit Caleb harder than any lightning strike. You're safe here, he said simply. He grabbed a clean towel from the hook by the stove and draped it around her shoulders. Leah's fingers caught the fabric, holding on like it was the only solid thing in the room. While she dried off, Caleb knelt at the hearth, stacking kindling with steady hands, giving her space to breathe. The fire flared to life, warm and glowing, pushing back the angry shadows pressed against the windows. When he turned, Leah stood close to the heat, her silhouette softening as steam rose from her wet clothes. He slid a plate of cornbread toward her, still warm from earlier in the day. Eat, he said, helps with the shaking. Leah hesitated only a moment before tearing off a small piece. The firelight made her look younger, but also older, like someone who had carried too many storms inside her chest for too long. They sat near the stove, not touching, not speaking, just listening to the wind scream past the walls. The silence wasn't empty. It was thick with something unnamed. At one point, another thunderclap boomed so close the whole house rattled. Leah's breath hitched sharply. Without thinking, she reached out, her hand brushing Caleb's sleeve. It was the lightest touch, but it landed like a spark struck against flint. Caleb didn't pull away. He let her hand rest there, barely touching, barely holding, but enough to bridge the trembling space between them, enough to anchor her, enough to make his heart stumble in a way he hadn't let it in years. After a long while, the storm eased. The rain softened to a steady patter. The thunder murmured instead of roaring. Leah finally exhaled deeply, like someone surfacing from deep water. I should head home, she murmured. Caleb didn't argue, though every instinct told him to. He grabbed a lantern, lit it, and handed it to her. She took it carefully, fingers brushing his, another spark. On the porch, the world shimmered under rain and moonlight. Leah paused at the steps, turning back. Her hair glowed in the lantern's warm circle of light. Thank you, she said softly, for an everything. Caleb nodded, unable to trust his voice. He watched her walk down the path, lantern swaying gently in her hand, casting a warm trail through the wet darkness. The storm clouds parted just enough for the moon to slip through. And standing there with rain dripping off the brim of his hat, Caleb realized he wasn't watching a neighbor walk home. He was watching the first flicker of something he wasn't ready to name. Something he wasn't sure he deserved, but something he couldn't look away from. By late September, the prairie had turned the color of warm honey. The air carried that crisp, earthy scent only harvest season could bring, and the town of Willow Creek came alive in a way it rarely did during the long summer months. Kids ran through the dirt lot, boots kicking up dust clouds while vendors hammered signs into the dry ground. Laughter floated above the hum of chatter and fiddle music. Caleb wasn't one for crowds, but Leah had asked if he'd help her bring a few crates of vegetables and hand-tied sage bundles to the harvest fair. And when Leah asked for something, he found himself saying yes before thinking twice. They arrived early, Caleb unloading pumpkins and corn, while Leah arranged her herbs with careful, intentional hands. She brought color to their booth, woven cloth from her tribe, small bowls filled with sweetgrass, cedar, and desert lavender. The moment people approached, she eased into the community like she'd been born there. Children flocked around her. She showed them how to braid thin strips of yucca fiber into simple bracelets, her fingers moving with gentle precision. A group of little girls giggled when she painted tiny white dots on their cheeks using a plant-based paste. This means light, she told them softly. Carry it with you. Caleb stood back for a moment, arms crossed loosely, watching her with a mix of admiration and quiet awe. She had a way of fitting into any space while still remaining completely herself. Rooted, calm, steady like the land she respected. But the peaceful rhythm broke the moment a polished black SUV rolled into the lot. A man stepped out, tall, clean-cut, wearing a crisp jacket that didn't belong anywhere near dirt roads or wood-smoked air. He walked with the confident stride of someone used to marble floors and glass offices. "Leah," he called, surprise cutting through his smooth tone. Leah's hands stilled. Her expression tightened, barely but enough for Caleb to notice. "Richard," she said, standing a little straighter. "Richard Gray." Leah had mentioned him once, in passing. A colleague from the city. A man who'd worked with her on some tribal health initiative. But Caleb had imagined someone different, softer, less polished. Richard approached with a bright, expensive smile. "I can't believe this. You just vanished from everything, and here you are. Out in the middle of..." He glanced around at the fairgrounds, at the hay bales, the horses, the dusty boots and sunburned ranchers. "Well, out here." Leah didn't return the smile. "What brings you to Willow Creek?" she asked. "Passing through on business," he replied. "Developers want access to some land north of here. I recognized your name on a local program's mailing list. Had to see if it was really you." Then his gaze swept over her booth, the herbs, the woven cloth, the hand-tied bundles. "This is very different from the Leah I knew." His laugh was thin. "Is this what you're doing now?" Caleb felt something tighten in his chest, but he stayed silent. Richard continued, oblivious. "Last time I saw you, you were giving a speech to donors in a red dress that probably cost more than this entire booth." He chuckled. "We raised nearly $2 million that night. Remember? Cameras everywhere. Press interviews. Mayor shaking your hand." Leah's shoulders stiffened. A flicker of shame or maybe frustration passed through her eyes. Richard didn't stop. "And the gala after? You danced the whole night. Hard to imagine you here selling sage to farmers." The words hung heavy in the warm afternoon air. A few people nearby turned to look. Caleb felt himself shrinking back, not because of what Richard said, but because of how effortlessly the man pulled Leah's past into the open. A past filled with city lights, money, influence. Things Caleb had never touched and never would. He didn't belong in that picture. He knew it. And suddenly, standing there beside her booth, he felt like a stray drifting too far from his own land. Leah reached for a bowl of lavender, hands slightly unsteady. "Richard," she said quietly, "that was another life." "But it was yours," he replied. "You belong there." Caleb didn't wait to hear more. He stepped back from the booth, tipping his hat toward Leah even though she wasn't looking at him. "I'll check on the horses," he muttered. He didn't have horses there. He just needed to breathe. He walked toward the edge of the fairgrounds, boots stirring dust with each step. Dust that rose behind him like a curtain closing. When Leah finally turned, Caleb was already swallowed by the movement of the crowd and the heat shimmering off the dirt road. She stood frozen among the noise and color of the harvest fair, heart sinking as she watched him disappear into a blur of strangers, lost somewhere between the sunlight and the dust. The days after the harvest fair dragged like heavy boots through mud. Caleb threw himself into work with a fierceness that bordered on punishing. He rose before the sun, fixed every loose hinge on the ranch, repaired fence posts that didn't really need repairing, and rode the far pasture twice a day for no reason except to be away from everything that reminded him of her. Dusty and Blue watched him with the concerned eyes only good dogs possess. Even Crow, his temperamental stallion, nudged Caleb's shoulder once, as if asking what storm he was hiding from. But Caleb didn't talk, didn't think, didn't let himself feel. He just worked until the muscles in his back screamed, because exhaustion was easier to hold than the image of Leah standing with that man. Laughing lightly, caught off guard, pulled back into a world he knew nothing about. He had seen the way Richard Gray looked at her, like someone who had known the polished version of her, the one who wore red dresses and spoke on big stages, and not the woman who planted sweetgrass at dawn. The truth sat like a splinter in Caleb's chest. He didn't know where he belonged in her life, or whether he belonged at all. On the fourth day, as a thin veil of autumn drizzle swept over the prairie, someone knocked on his door. Caleb froze. It wasn't a storm this time, just a quiet, persistent knock, one that didn't demand but didn't go away either. When he opened the door, Leah stood there. Rain clung to her braid, darkening it to the color of midnight. Her jacket was speckled with dust turned to mud, but her eyes, those deep, steady, ancient eyes, held something that made Caleb's throat tighten. Determination and sadness. "You're avoiding me," she said softly. Her voice didn't accuse, it simply stated truth. Caleb swallowed hard. He stepped back, letting her in. She entered quietly, leaving the door open as if symbolically refusing to close herself off. He didn't sit. She didn't either. They stood facing each other in the middle of his living room, the dim afternoon light stretching long shadows across the wooden floor. "Leah," he began, but the words scattered like dry leaves. She took a breath. "You think Richard showing up means I'm someone else? Someone who belongs somewhere else?" He clenched his jaw. "I don't know who you are, Leah. That's the problem." A flicker of hurt passed across her face. Quick but unmistakable. "I left that world," she said. "All of it. The speeches, the events, the donors, the fake smiles. I left because it was killing something inside me. Something important." Caleb didn't respond. He stared at his hands instead. The hands that knew how to fix busted gates but not broken feelings. Leah stepped closer, not invading, but refusing to let distance do all the talking. "I came here because my grandmother was born on this land," she continued. "Because I wanted to breathe again. Because I needed a place where the earth speaks louder than people." Her voice trembled slightly. "And I stayed because it finally felt right." He looked up then. Her eyes were raw, unguarded, honest in a way that made him want to step back and forward at the same time. But the fear in him, the deep, stubborn, old fear, pushed before his heart could. "I'm just a cattleman, Leah," he said quietly. "I mend fences, I raise horses, I eat the same food every week. My whole world fits between these hills. You," he shook his head, "you used to stand on stages. You used to speak to hundreds. You come from places I can't even picture." The silence after those words hit her like cold water. She tried to smile, brave, gentle, forgiving, but grief wove itself through the curve of her lips. "That's what you see?" she whispered. "A broken woman who used to live bigger than you?" Caleb didn't answer. The truth sat in the space between them like barbed wire. Leah's breath shook. She reached for her coat, buttoning it with slow, steady fingers. "I won't push you," she said. "Not your heart, not your fear, not your sense of who we are." He opened his mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to call her back from whatever cliff she was walking toward, but the words refused to come. Caleb exhaled. "I don't want to be a disappointment." Leah's eyes softened painfully. "You aren't," she said, "but you think you are." She stepped toward the door. A misty rain blurred the world outside, turning the prairie into a gray watercolor. "Take the time you need," she murmured. "I won't ask for anything more." And with that, she stepped into the drizzle. No umbrella, no lantern. Just her lone silhouette swallowed piece by the soft, persistent curtain of autumn rain. Caleb watched her go, his hand gripping the doorframe until his knuckles turned white. Her braid moved like a dark line in the grayness. Her shoulders were lifted, but he could see the weight she carried. And he realized, too late, that the person he feared disappointing was the one person who had never asked him to be anything but himself. The prairie wind pushed against the house, rattling the eaves like a reprimand. Caleb stayed at the doorway long after Leah disappeared into the rain. The days after their confrontation settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket, thick, gray, and hard to breathe through. Caleb moved through them as though he were underwater. He woke before dawn, worked until his muscles burned, and collapsed into bed only to stare at the ceiling for hours. Dusty and Blue followed him quietly, sensing the shift in him, offering silent companionship he barely noticed. He didn't talk to anyone, didn't visit town, didn't ride past the fence line where Leah usually tended her herbs at sunrise. It was easier this way, he told himself. Easier to shut the world out than to face the knot of emotions that had been building in his chest since the day Richard Gray stood in front of her, reminding Caleb of everything he wasn't. So he threw himself into the work, mending fence posts, sorting tack, cutting winter hay, even repainting the old tool shed, something he hadn't bothered with in years. But work didn't silence the ache. It only buried it, and even then not deep enough. At night, when the wind blew cold across the prairie and the coyotes started their lonely howls, the silence seeped back in. Caleb would sit at the edge of his bed, elbows on knees, palms pressed to his face, feeling the echo of Leah's hand on his arm, the soft, steady touch she'd given him on that stormy night. A touch meant to comfort, not claim. A touch he'd pulled away from later, without meaning to. He wondered if she regretted reaching for him at all. Across the property line, Leah moved through her days like someone walking through a half-remembered dream. She cared for her plants, dried herbs on twine, ground cedar bark, and sage for winter medicines. Her hands worked, but her eyes were distant. The fire inside them, quiet but bright, had dulled into something hollow. She did not go to the fence anymore. She did not brew extra coffee. She did not leave small pouches of herbs on his gate like she sometimes did. She kept her world still, hoping the quiet would steady her again. But every night, when thunder rumbled faintly from the far-off mountains, she would pause, hand hovering over the lantern, remembering the warmth of Caleb's hearth, his steady presence, his silence that somehow felt like shelter. She missed him, but she would not chase someone who needed distance. The distance between them felt almost physical, like two stars pulled into separate orbits, close enough to sense each other's presence in the dark, but too far to touch. Sometimes when Caleb rode the northern trail, he saw the soft plume of smoke rising from Leah's chimney. A part of him wanted to turn his horse toward her house, to knock on her door, to apologize for letting his insecurity speak louder than his heart. But he never did. And sometimes when Leah walked the creek bed to gather wild mint, she would see Caleb in the distance, hat tilted down, shoulders tense, dogs trotting beside him. Her steps always slowed, breath catching in her throat. But she didn't call out. Instead, she let the wind carry the things neither of them dared say. As autumn settled in, the world around them transformed. The cottonwoods turned gold, then shed their leaves in sheets that covered the earth like a faded quilt. Mornings arrived dressed in white mist, thick enough to swallow the fence lines. Frost clung to the tall grass, turning each blade into a shard of glass. The air smelled of cold earth, old pine, and the distant promise of winter snow. And still, nothing passed between them. 3 long weeks slipped by, each one mirroring the last. Caleb grew tired in a way that had nothing to do with labor. His chest felt too full at night and too empty during the day. Leah's absence, her quiet footsteps, her soft laughter, the way she looked at the sunrise as if it were speaking to her, created a hollow space inside him he didn't know how to fill. One night, the wolves cried longer than usual, sharp, mournful, drawn-out calls that cut straight through the walls of the ranch house. Caleb lay awake, staring at the unlit lantern on his windowsill. He realized then that he hadn't lit it once since the night she stood in his doorway, shivering, trusting him. He pressed a hand to the glass. Maybe this was the price of letting fear speak louder than truth. On the 21st evening, as fog curled low across the fields and a thin drizzle began painting the world silver, Caleb finished his chores and walked toward the ranch house, boots dragging in the mud. He paused by the porch, hand resting on the rail, breath ghosting in the cold air. He thought the silence would stretch into another night. Then a surgeon, knock, knock, soft, tentative. At the side gate, not the front. Caleb stiffened. He turned slowly, heart thudding in his chest, unsure whether to hope or fear what waited for him there. But he knew, deep down, he knew this sound would change everything. The knock at the side gate didn't sound urgent, just soft, patient, like someone testing whether they still had the right to be there. Caleb wiped his palms on his jeans and stepped outside into the pale morning light. Frost clung to the dry grass and the air carried that sharp winter bite that foretold snow coming soon. Leah stood on the other side of the gate. She wasn't dressed in anything special, just her usual worn work shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, boots dusted with earth. Her braid was a little messy, a few strands escaping to brush her cheek. But what caught Caleb first wasn't her face. It was the basket in her arms, a small woven crate filled with freshly pulled carrots, misshapen, dirt still clinging to their roots, tops wilting slightly from the cold. They weren't pretty. They weren't arranged. They weren't polished for a market table. They were honest, grown by her hands, pulled from her soil, and brought here to him. Leah held the basket like an apology she didn't know how to say out loud. "I thought you might need these," she said, her voice steady but soft. "They're the first ones this season. Not much, but it's what I have." Caleb didn't reach for the basket. He simply stared, longer than he should have, taking in the faint smudge of dirt across her wrist, the way her breath misted in the cold, the quiet hope flickering behind her eyes. It had been 3 weeks of silence, 3 weeks of avoiding each other's shadow, 3 weeks of him replaying their last conversation until the words felt like thorns. He cleared his throat. "You didn't have to bring anything." "I know," she said, not defensive, not wounded, just honest. "But I wanted to." A gust of icy wind swept through, and she shivered. Caleb instinctively stepped aside and opened the gate wider. "You want some coffee? Before the sun gets higher?" Leah hesitated only a moment before nodding. "I'd like that." They walked toward his porch. Slowly, not side by side, but not far apart either. The cold made their breaths visible, drifting like two small clouds that kept finding their way back to each other. Inside the house, Caleb poured 2 mugs of hot coffee. He wasn't good at fancy brews like Leah, just simple ranch coffee, strong enough to put hair on a man's chest. But Leah accepted the cup with both hands, warming her fingers around it. They sat at the small wooden table, facing the frosted window. Silence stretched, not sharp this time, not painful, just a quiet space waiting to be filled. Leah finally spoke. "I don't want the gate between us to stay closed," she said. She didn't look at him. She stared into her coffee, as if the words were too heavy to lift while meeting his eyes. "Not after everything." Caleb looked down at his hands, rough and calloused. The same hands that fixed fences, birthed calves, held storms at bay. The same hands he once feared weren't enough for someone like her. "I don't either," he replied. Leah's shoulders dropped, the slightest exhale slipping past her lips. A sound of relief, of acceptance. Maybe even forgiveness. "I didn't come to ask for an apology," she continued. "And I'm not here to demand anything. I just wanted you to know that I'm still here, and I'm not walking away because things got hard." She lifted her gaze, finally meeting his. "I've walked away from too many things in my life. I don't want to walk away from this." Caleb felt something shift deep in him, slow, steady, like thawing ground. "I was scared," he admitted. "Didn't think I belonged in your world. Didn't think I could measure up." "No one asked you to," she said gently. "I left that world because it wasn't mine anymore." He swallowed hard. "So what now?" Leah pushed the basket of carrots slightly toward him across the table. "We start small, like these. They're crooked, they're dirty, but they're real. That's enough for me." Caleb reached out, first toward the carrots, then toward her hand. His fingers brushed hers. She didn't pull away. Their hands found each other slowly, cautiously, not rushed, not desperate. Just steady, warm despite the cold, a promise without words. Outside, the sun finally crested over the horizon, casting a pale gold across the frozen fields. Inside, Caleb and Leah sat together, hands joined, letting the warmth between them grow in its own time. It wasn't a dramatic reunion, it wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And for the first time in a long while, the gate between them, real and invisible, stood open. Winter settled over Montana the way an old blanket settles over tired shoulders, slowly at first, then all at once. Frost crept across the fields, turning every blade of grass into a thin shard of silver. The sky grew pale, the wind sharper. Yet strangely, the season felt less harsh for both Caleb and Leah. They didn't live together. They didn't need to. But somehow, without either of them naming it, they began living beside one another. 2 separate homes, one shared rhythm. Most mornings, Caleb woke to find a tin cup on his porch, steam curling from Leah's hand-ground coffee. She never knocked, never waited. She simply left the cup on the top step, a gesture warm enough to cut through the biting cold. In return, Caleb left cornbread or biscuits outside her door, wrapped in cloth to keep the chill away. Once Leah opened her door early and caught him mid-step. They didn't speak. They just exchanged a small smile, soft, shy, almost boyish on his part, and that was enough to make the whole day lighter. When fences warped in the cold, they mended them together. When a stubborn mare refused to be saddled, they calmed her together. When the nights dropped below freezing, they lit lanterns at their porches, 2 small flames blinking across the darkness like silent signals. "I'm here, you're not alone, I'm here." Leah carried gifts of knowledge the way others carried baskets of fruit. She taught Caleb how to warm his back with a poultice made from Apache herbs, wild mint, yarrow, and bear root. She showed him how to listen to the wind, not just for speed or direction, but for tone. "Wind has moods," she told him one dusk. "Storms whisper before they scream." He'd never thought of weather as something alive, But the way she explained it, hands moving gently through the air, made him believe. More than once, her voice saved him from riding out when a squall was building. "Not today," she'd warn, and she was always right. In return, Caleb taught her the language of horses. He showed her where to stand when approaching a nervous gelding, how to steady her breath so the animal would mirror her calm, and how to assert herself without raising her voice. "Don't fight a horse head-on," he told her one afternoon as a dusk-gray mare pawed the dirt angrily. "Guide her. Let her feel you mean no harm." Leah followed his directions carefully. When the mare finally lowered her head, accepting her, Leah's smile lit the whole barn. Caleb felt that smile somewhere low in his chest, the way a man feels warmth after being cold for too long. Evenings became their favorite time. They'd finish their chores, wash up, and meet at the fence line without planning to. Caleb would bring a blanket. Leah would bring tea brewed with spruce tips. They sat on the old wooden swing outside her home or leaned against the rail looking out over the snowy fields. Winter nights stretched wide and quiet. The sky was a black bowl scattered with stars. Sharp, bright, countless. Leah knew the constellations by their Apache names and told stories her grandmother once whispered to her. "That one," she said one night, pointing upward, "is the hunter who never missed. My people say he guards travelers alone on long roads." Caleb listened, more to her voice than the stars. Her stories stitched threads between them, thin at first, then stronger. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. Sometimes silence felt like a warm coat shared between them, wrapped tight enough to keep the cold out. One night, as frost glittered on the fence rail, Leah placed her hand over his. Light, steady, certain. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even a question. It was simply belonging, offered freely. Caleb didn't move. He didn't shy away. He just turned his hands slowly so their fingers aligned, a quiet reply that said more than words ever could. Winter deepened, but neither felt its usual bite. The land looked softer. Nights felt brighter. The long silence that had once haunted Caleb now made sense. Maybe it had been waiting for a voice like Leah's to fill it. And she did, without force, without trying, just by being there. It wasn't love formed in fire or haste. It was love shaped by proximity, by kindness, by shared breath on cold nights and warm hands under starlight. A bond made not of grand gestures, but of small, steady ones. Winter softened, the snow pulled back from the fields, and Montana breathed again. The sky widened, the air cleared, and life settled into a slower rhythm, one that matched the quiet understanding forming between Caleb and Leah. They didn't move in together. They didn't rush, didn't label, didn't try to turn what they had into anything louder than it needed to be. But the space between their two homesteads changed. First, it was the mug of hot coffee Caleb left on Leah's porch before dawn. Then it was the loaf of sweet cornbread she'd leave in a cloth-wrapped bundle on his fence post. Then came evenings spent checking the perimeter, riding side by side, or simply standing shoulder to shoulder while the prairie turned blue under dusk. Their homes remained separate, but their hearts kept time with each other, steady, unhurried, certain. And the old wooden gate between their properties, once broken and repaired by Caleb's patient hands, was never locked again. Sometimes the wind pushed it open. Sometimes Leah left it ajar after feeding the horses. Sometimes Caleb paused with his hand resting on the top rail, just feeling the smooth grain under his palm, thinking about how that gate used to be something he hid behind, something that kept him safe. Now it was something that welcomed him forward. The land noticed too. The birds nested closer to both houses. The horses wandered freely between the pastures. Even Dusty and Blue seemed to understand that the boundary that once separated two lives had become a meeting place instead. Leah belonged to the land, its quiet power, its rhythm, its ancient wisdom. Caleb belonged to the ranch, the sweat, the work, the wide sky he had learned to shoulder. And somehow, in ways neither of them could explain, they now belonged to each other in a way that didn't need vows or declarations. One evening, the prairie glowed copper under a low-setting sun. Abigail, the proud led mare, threw her head back and released a sharp, bright whinny that carried across both properties. It wasn't alarm. It wasn't warning. It was almost celebratory. Caleb stepped onto his porch, wiping dust from his hands. He saw movement at the far end of the path, just beyond the gate. Leah. She was walking toward him with unhurried steps, the breeze lifting her braid behind her like a dark ribbon. In her hands was a small buckskin pouch, the one she used only for bread baked with intention, with meaning. Cornbread, the simple kind, the kind she made for people she trusted, people she kept close. Caleb felt something settle in his chest, something warm, steady, like a lantern finally finding its place on the hook. Leah reached the porch stairs just as the light dipped low, brushing the world in a soft amber wash. Caleb opened the door before she could knock, leaning against the frame with that quiet half-smile he rarely let anyone see. "It's still warm," Leah said, holding up the pouch. "So am I," Caleb answered, voice low but gentle. She laughed, a sound he wanted to hear again and again. Leah stepped onto the porch, dusting her boots before entering. Caleb took the pouch from her hands, their fingers brushing lightly. That small touch, after everything they'd been through, felt like a promise spoken without words. Inside, the lantern glowed with a soft, golden pulse. The fire crackled. The storm nights were long gone. Only peace remained. Leah set her coat on the hook near the door. Caleb poured 2 mugs of strong coffee, the way she liked it. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. The comfort between them was deeper than conversation. Outside, Abigail pawed the earth, snorting into the cooling wind. The prairie breathed slow. The sky stretched wide with stars just beginning to appear. Caleb glanced toward the front door where the old gate stood open, creaking softly in the evening breeze. "No lock, never again." And as Leah moved closer, her shoulder brushing his as the first star blinked awake above them, Caleb thought, for the first time in many years, that maybe peace wasn't something you chased. Maybe peace was something that walked through an open gate, carrying warm cornbread and a quiet smile. Something that chose you back.